speaker for today, though not an Odia, knows a fair deal about Odisha's culture, Odisha's history, Odisha's identity. But let me first tell you something about his identity. A celebrated author, he has written many books on India and its various trade routes. In his latest book, he has spoken at length regarding Odisha, from Kharavela's revenge to Kaudinya's wedding, to Bali Jatra, Kartika Purnima, Topoi. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, Government India, has a lot of our favorite stories to tell. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, who is going to speak on Indian history as seen from Odisha. Mr. Sanyal, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm on a very slippery slope here as a Bengali economist talking to a room full of Odia scholars about Odia history. In fact, I was surprised when I began to research the history of Odisha and discovered the extraordinary, colorful history and long history of this state, and shocked the extent to which it has simply been wiped out of our memory. Not just at a national level, even in Odisha, I was shocked to find many young people don't seem to know very much about it. In fact, the only place that you're likely to come across Odisha in our national narrative of history is about the story of Ashoka conquering Kalinga, carrying out genocide, and then, shocked by his own cruelty, essentially becoming a pacifist. Now, this is a story that I used to also believe till a few years ago. So I began to really research it, and I found something very odd. Now, the problem is this entire narrative is based on very thin evidence. And in fact, as I will show you, the evidence, to the extent it exists at all, actually tells a very different story. So the first thing I've decided that since this repentance story is much talked about, where does it come from? So I went and visited all the Ashokan edicts in Odisha. And quite shockingly, you will find that none of Ashoka's edicts in Odisha mention his regret. The place where this regret is mentioned is an inscription that is all of them are far away from Odisha. In fact, the main one that is usually quoted is currently in Pakistan. But even if you go to this inscription that I mentioned, which is now in Pakistan, and read it properly, in fact, just read the paragraph after the one in which he supposedly expresses some repentance for carrying out this massacre in Kalinga. Just read the next paragraph. What does Ashoka say? You forest tribes, if you behave badly, I will do the same thing to you. This is hardly the words of a pacifist. And indeed, there are several Buddhist texts which clearly mention this. And in fact, even in this context, it is quite interesting. No Buddhist texts, or in fact, even in his inscriptions, do they mention that Ashoka became a Buddhist as a result of his repentance. Not just this, we have some evidence to suggest that the people of Kalinga never forgave Ashoka for the massacre he carried out. And why do we know this? We know this because we have an inscription at Hathigumpha by a great king called Kharavela. And in this inscription, he mentions various things. But amongst them, he says that he pushed back the invasions of the Andhra king, the Satavahanas. He mentions that he pushes back the Greeks to Mathura. And then, very interestingly, he mentions that he goes to Magad and he makes the king of Pataliputra bow to him. And that, after that, he brings back the Jain idols that they had taken away from him. He writes this inscription in Hathigumpha. Now, if you go to Hathigumpha, by the way, is on a small hill just outside of Bhubaneswar. You climb up to the top of to this hill, stand in front of this cave and look at the inscription and then look across. You will see Dhauli Hill. And what is there on Dhauli Hill? On Dhauli Hill is Ashoka's inscription. So what is Kharavela trying to do? By putting that inscription where he is, Kharavela is telling Ashoka, we remember what you did, but I have avenged it. Oddly enough, based on almost no evidence. And in fact, in Indian tradition, Ashoka is not considered a great king at all. The great king in Indian tradition was Chandragupta Maurya, his grandfather, and his guru, Chanakya, not Ashoka. Ashoka was in fact forgotten in Indian history. He was rediscovered by the British and then elevated in the 20th century to be a great king for political reasons which I will not get into. So now, which is the maritime history of Odisha? Somewhere in the Iron Age, 5th, 6th century, 7th century BC, there is a sudden explosion of maritime activity. There's lots of archaeological sites popping up everywhere these days about this. And you will discover one interesting thing happens. Now, such a colorful history, unfortunately, is not at all taught to us. And what I'm trying to do through my little effort is to try and collect a little bit of these histories and try to reinvent and reinvigorate our understanding of ourselves. We can feel through our legends, through our festivals, much of this history. And one obvious way in which, of course, in Odisha this is celebrated is through the festival of Kartik Purnima. The reason it is celebrated at that time, to understand that, you need to go on Kartik Purnima night to Chandrabhaga beach, which is just next to Konarak, and stand there at 5 in the morning, like I did a few years ago, on the beach. And then, in an instant, you will understand what is going on. Essentially, this is the moment when the breeze stops flowing from the south to north and begins to blow from north to south. This is November, second week usually, and the breeze shifts. So obviously, this is the breeze you need in order to sail to Bali. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.